All right. Hello, everybody. Hope you guys are well. I am coming to you guys to do one more reading from Lacanian Psychoanalysis and Eastern Orthodox Christian Anthropology and Dialogue. Again, the authors are Dr. Carl Waits and Dr. Teresa Clement Tisdale. And I've reached out to both of them to see if I can get them on the podcast and have a conversation with them. Because what I'm going to be reading from here, chapter 9, it's entitled Ego and Ego Fate. I have to say they've done a remarkable job of condensing, analyzing, and expressing two very complicated systems. Obviously one being Lacanian psychoanalysis, the other one being Orthodox theology, and the information expressed here and the way that is put together is just remarkable, and I want to see what you guys think, so bear with it. It's about 10 pages, and I was going to do a condensed kind of overview on it, but I really want to read from it and see if it elicits the same response from you guys, those that are interested at this kind of convergence of psychoanalysis, psychology, and orthodoxy. The only thing I can compare it to when I was reading it, the pangs of salience and truth that were coming at me, it's almost like when I've been reading the lives and the works of the saints. I'm not saying that this is a work done by any saintly person or anything like that. I'm not saying that at all, but it's really clear and straightforward expressions of very complicated and complex topics, and it answers the question of what is the self in a very unique way by juxtaposing, Lacan and orthodoxy, and it's really opened my eyes really in a different way to read Lacan. That is really, I'm just really grateful for. So I know I'm talking it up here, but I'm just going to start and see what you guys think. Again, it's about 10 pages. I'm going to try to get it through it all right now, and we'll kind of go from there. All right, again, this is from chapter 9, which is the second to the last chapter, and is entitled Ego and Ego Fate. And we'll just jump right in. One of the critical and most central questions of anthropology as a field of philosophy and theology is the question of the self. Orthodox anthropology has developed over the course of the Church's history, but many significant developments occurred in the centuries centered on the Christological controversies. These controversies largely revolved around disagreements about the person of Christ and his relationship to and between his humanity and divinity. They were resolved in a series of ecumenical councils, of which the Orthodox Church recognizes 7. These councils provide some of the fundamental dogma and doctrine regarding the person of Christ in anthropology. Of interest here are the First Council of Nicaea, the First Ecumenical Council, the Council of Ephesus, the Third Ecumenical Council, and the Council of Chalcedon, the Fourth Ecumenical Council. The participants of the First Council of Nicaea, 325, debated the relationship of Christ and God in response to the Arian controversy. Arius and his disciples insisted Christ was a created being, a separate essence from the Father. Saint Athanasius and others argued against the Arians that Christ was also truly God. The council chose the term homoousios, H-O-M-O-O-U-S-I-O-U-S, to describe the relationship of Christ to the Father, that they are, quote, one in essence. The council decided in favor of those arguing for one essence, preserving the divinity of Christ. The issue of Christ's divinity was largely resolved by the Second Ecumenical Council in 381. Thereafter, the relationship of Christ's humanity and divinity was called into question when Nestorius' arguments rose to prominence. Nestorius grappled with the question of how God, in Christ being one essence with the Father, might also be born of a woman. He emphasized the sharp distinction between the two natures of Christ, the human and the divine, to the point of essentially arguing for two persons, Word and Christ, having conflated person and nature. St. Cyril of Alexandria pressed the opposing argument that the two natures were more closely related and that Christ was indeed one person despite two natures. This controversy led to the Council of Ephesus in 431, which condemned Nestorius' teachings. The Fourth Ecumenical Council, the Council of Chalcedon 451, was convened to respond to an extreme form of St. Cyril's arguments, that Christ was one in person and one in nature. The Council of Chalcedon declared that Christ was in fact one person in two natures, one person of one essence with the Father and of one essence with humanity. The distinctions between nature and person upheld in these councils rely upon certain terminology as church fathers appropriated for explicatory use. At the time of the first council, ousia, O-U-S-I-A, was a philosophical term that had implications of ultimate being in the sense of the one, in which all identity would be reabsorbed. In defending the same essence of the Father and the Son, the Fathers utilized this term, but found it necessary to affirm the differentiation of persons as well, so that it was clear Father and Son will not ultimately collapse in one identity. However, the vocabulary of ancient philosophy lacked a term for person in an ontologically meaningful sense. Persona for the Latins and prosopon for the Greeks signified a, quote, delimiting, deceptive, and finally illusory aspect of the individual, the masked face of impersonal being, close quote. This is because prosopon was the term for the masks utilized by ancient Greek actors. Persona served much the same function for the Latins, essentially having, quote, nothing to do with the ontology of the person, close quote. This created difficulties in referring to the persons of the Trinity as prosopa or personae, as these did not communicate the reality of the person. In seeking to resolve this, the Fathers repurposed another word that was essentially synonymous with ousia, hypostasis, hypostasis. Hypostasis also referred to ontological being, but with reference to singularity or particularity and instance of the being, while ousia pertained more broadly to essence. The Fathers essentially redefined the term hypostasis to identify it with prosopon, thereby introducing the concept of person with the ontological signification intact, the person as a particular instance of the essence. The change of definition led to much confusion. The formulation of the Trinity in the West was based on the language of persona. So the Eastern Church read into the Western formulation of three personae in one essence, a sort of modalism or Sabellian tendency. However, the Eastern Church's formulation of three hypostases, without understanding the term's redefinition, sounded to the Western Church like, quote, tritheism. The ontological component of hypostasis provides space in the Orthodox Church for a formulation of the Trinity that approaches the concept first through persons rather than substance. For Zizoulas, God is free from all necessity, including the necessity of being. He exists through his own free will. Quote, it is precisely his Trinitarian existence that constitutes this confirmation. The Father out of love, that is, freely, begets the Son and brings forth the Spirit. If God exists, he exists because the Father exists. God as a person, as the hypostasis of the Father, makes the one divine substance to be that which it is, the one God. Close quote. Thus, God's mode of existence is love, the act of love free from necessity. It is this that hypostasis, that, quote, hypostasis God, constitutes his being, close quote. This means God himself, quote, is not subject to the necessity of substance, close quote. That is, God does not exist by necessity. However, the human is subject to the necessity of existence, and is thus not fully person, that is, has not been hypostasized. Becoming an, quote, authentic person for Zizoulas is a matter of theosis. Quote, the authentic person must be uncreated, that is, unbounded by any necessity, including its own existence, close quote. In this sense, theosis is, quote, the eternal survival of the person as a unique, unrepeatable, and free hypostasis, as loving and being loved, close quote. Although the person exists outside of salvation as a hypostasis of biological existence, Zizoulas argued this existence is not an experience of the fullness of personhood because it is A, determined by necessity, B, separated into individuals, splitting nature, and C, concludes, quote, with the last and greatest passion of man, with the disintegration of the hypostasis, which is death. This biological hypostasis is, quote, the mask of hypocrisy, the fortress of individualism, the vehicle of the final separation, death, close quote. In Theosis, Zizoulas emphasized equally that neither the body nor eros, the two components of the hypostasis, should be destroyed in salvation. Rather, quote, they nevertheless change their activity, adapt themselves to the new, quote, mode of existence of the hypostasis, reject from this activity of theirs, which is constitutive of the human hypostasis, whatever creates the tragic, death-carrying element in man, and retain whatever makes the person to be love, freedom, and life, close quote. Therefore, the fate of the human hypostasis in salvation is not reabsorption into some unitary one, but transformation through identification with the hypostatic union of Christ and in relationship to God. Authentic personhood for Zizoulas is a matter of communion with God and freedom from necessity in energetic union. Linares presented a similar account of the person, both in relationship to God and in the absence of this relationship. Linares contrasted the mode of existence of fallen nature, quote-unquote natural autonomy, with the mode of existence of Christ in communion with God. The one who denies self-transcendent communion with God in his energies partakes in what is, quote, equally a personal existential event, an active reference of the freedom of the person, that yet refers its existence not to a relationship to the person of God, but to a non-relationship to the reality of the void or the natural distance between God and humankind outside the mode of life, close quote. This is the existential reality that Zizoulas called the biological hypostasis. The personal and relational are the ground of ontology in Zizoulas and Linares, not the generalized concept of being. To be is to be a person in relationship. Linares is especially explicit in stating, quote, no personal hypostasis, whether divine or human, is a fragment or part of divine or human being. On the contrary, each person recapitulates and expresses the whole mode of being, complete divinity or humanity. Neither divinity nor humanity exist outside the existent hypostasis, that is to say, outside the persons. The person hypostasizes being. It constitutes being as existent reality, close quote. There is no such thing as the abstract being or essence of God or humanity outside the specific hypostasis that instantiate being. This safeguards persons from becoming enveloped in the conceptual definitions Linares saw plaguing Western theologians' approach to God or the idea of God. It also protects the understanding of human nature as something personal and unique rather than abstract. One final word remains to be said regarding prosopon as person. Linares recounted the etymological significance of prosopon and its implication for understanding personhood. The derivation of prosopon from pros, towards, and ops, eye, face, or countenance, identifies the person as that which turns toward another. This illustrates and undergirds the Orthodox understanding of personhood as inherently relational rather than individualistic. Losky noted that theosis is, quote, supreme synthesis through man of God and the created cosmos, wherein rests the meaning of all Christian anthropology. I'll read that again. Losky noted that theosis is, quote, supreme synthesis through man of God and the created cosmos, wherein rests the meaning of all Christian anthropology, close quote. The Orthodox conception of deification is deeply connected to essentially every facet of the faith. Christology, beliefs about creation, and most importantly, and most especially, anthropology. Our next section of the chapter is entitled Fate of the Hypostasis. Regarding theosis, Meyendorff, 1974, noted, quote, Byzantine theologians seldom devote much explicit attention to speculation about the exact fate of souls after death, close quote. The Orthodox do not expend extensive energy hypothesizing about things so distant from experience. Even so, there is a benefit to considering some of the Orthodox discussion of the nature of hell and the scope of salvation. On the topic of hell, Kallimyros, in 1980, delivered a polemic address about the relationship between the goodness of God and hell, and Kallimyros identified the same problem with Western theology as Romanides in 1998, namely that it attributes death to the work of God, either because God instituted it as a punishment or because death is natural. But is not God the creator of all natural things? Kallimyros, 1980. Kallimyros also distinguished between the angry and punitive God of the West and the God of the Eastern Church, whom he noted is, quote, not just with the human meaning of this word, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the selfish, close quote. God's mercy transcends human justice. Kallimyros continued, quote, God is good, loving and kind toward those who disregard, disobey, and ignore him. He never returns evil for evil. He never takes vengeance. His punishments are loving means of correction, as long as anything can be corrected and healed in this life. They never extend into eternity. He created everything good. Close quote. This good and loving God who offers mercy freely does not impose punishment in eternal damnation. Rather, Kallimyros was bold to say, quote, our salvation is our eternal death, is not a question of God's decision, close quote, because his will is always for salvation. Quote, but it is a question of our decision. It is a question of the decision of our free will, which God respects absolutely, close quote. God is judge in the very specific sense that he is the truth and the light. Judgment before God is the exposure of our hearts before the truth and the light of God. Because of this, heaven and hell are in fact the same thing experienced in two ways. For those who love God, quote, those hearts will rejoice in seeing God's light. For those who hate God, these men will suffer by receiving on their opened hearts this penetrating light of the truth. Close quote. Heaven and hell are not places, but direct experience of the light of God, the same God in two experiences. As for the scope of salvation, Metropolitan Kallistos of Dioclea wrote of the apokatastasis, which is the final restoration of all things. This idea, a form of universalism, is controversial in the Orthodox Church, as the Church condemned Origen as a heretic for advocating apokatastasis at the Fifth Ecumenical Council. However, as Metropolitan Kallistos noted, Origen was condemned for his entire theological system, which involved the pre-existence of souls and a pre-cosmic fall, ideas untenable in the broader context of Orthodox theology. Metropolitan Kallistos advocated for separating the belief in the reconciliation of all with God from the rest of Origen's system, given numerous scriptures that seem to strongly suggest the reconciliation of all. However, because of the freedom of the human will, Metropolitan Kallistos noted that the salvation of all is not, quote, a logical certainty, but a heartfelt aspiration, a visionary hope, close quote. The hope for the salvation of all through free choice is a hope not condemned by the Church. Indeed, St. Gregory of Nyssa expounded a final restoration, inclusive even of the devil. Metropolitan Kallistos illustrated the tension regarding beliefs about the afterlife with the story about St. Silouan the Athonite recounted by St. Sophrony. Quote, it was particularly characteristic of Staritz, elder Silouan, to pray for the dead suffering in the hell of separation from God. He could not bear to think that anyone would languish in outer darkness. I remember a conversation between him and a certain hermit who declared with evident satisfaction, God will punish all atheists. They will burn in everlasting fire. Obviously upset, Stoddard said, quote, tell me, supposing you went to paradise and there looked down and saw somebody burning in hellfire, would you feel happy? It can't be helped. It would be their own fault, said the hermit. The Stoddards answered him with a sorrowful countenance, quote, love could not bear that, he said. We must pray for all. Close quote. Thus, in orthodoxy, two primary issues in considering the fate of humanity are, first, that God does not utilize punitive measures, especially not for all eternity. Rather, heaven and hell are the same experience of the light, truth, and love of God from differing perspectives. Similarly, as God always wills salvation and allows for human freedom, an Orthodox Christian is able to hope for the salvation of all. All right, next section is entitled The Ego and Narcissism. Here we get into Lacan, the Lacanian portion of the chapter. Narcissism is a subject often interrogated by psychoanalysis, and Moncayo, 2008, offered a crucial investigation of narcissism and its, quote, forms and transformations. He posited that narcissism is a structural, not simply developmental configuration, and is not psychopathological unless the different structures are insufficiently differentiated within the subject. Moncayo outlined primary, secondary, tertiary, and fourth degree or end state narcissism. Prior to the assumption of the specular image in the mirror stage, there is not a unified ego for the child. This state of undifferentiation between the subject and other is constitutive of primary narcissism. The experience of primary narcissism in this state is therefore not a narcissism of ego cathexis, but has as its prototype intrauterine experience, which is, quote, a profound connection and interpretation of life processes, close quote. This primary narcissism is presubjective, in which there is a no ego, though, quote, no ego does not mean no presubjective narcissism, noting the psychoanalytic understanding of selfhood can approach, quote, the question of self before and beyond the ego. In the presubject and in the self as object, there is self-experience, even identity in the sense of sameness without difference, and in the sense of identity with the object as well as energy and libido, but there is no ego. Close quote. Moncayo does not perceive the psychoanalytic self as restricted to the imaginary structure of the ego. In exploring this concept, Moncayo associated secondary narcissism with the ideal ego in the identification with the object A, or the small object, the object cause of desire. In this identification, Moncayo characterized the ego as specular image, as a mirror that absorbs rather than reflects light, and when sending light out of itself, the light that, quote, the mirror projects onto the objects of the environment includes the shadow of the specular image as the visual and imaginary representations of the ego, close quote. Thus, the environment of the ego in secondary narcissism is inflected always with projections and misrecognitions from the ego. Secondary narcissism is the narcissism of the imaginary small object A. Remember, small object A is the object cause of desire. Tertiary narcissism, for Moncayo, pertains to the ego ideal and to the father rather than to the mother. The identification with the father here involves internalization of the father's will through an inscription, quote, that symbolically represents both the name and gaze of the father, close quote. This move is partially into the symbolic, but it may still serve an imaginary function as the name of the father takes the place of the desire of the mother, masking the lack in the subject, at least for a time. In contrast to these, Moncayo posited fourth degree or end-state narcissism. End-state narcissism is the movement beyond the imaginary father and the ideal ego and ego ideal. The symbolic father and phallus, as absent and as lack, are able to facilitate the subject of the real, where, quote, the metaphoric flower of the subject will emerge from the place where the ego died. For Mankeo, quote, it is only with the fourth degree of differentiation within narcissism that the subject can rebirth itself in the absence of imaginary ego identifications. The subject is reborn as a new signifier that appears thanks to the autonomy and dynamic self-creating capacity of the symbolic. Paradoxically, the agency of the subject is limited to the act of leaving empty the place of ego agency within the structure. Close quote. For Mankeo, this emptiness of the subject is the goal of analysis. For the self to be beyond ego, beyond identifications, in, quote, the wondrous emptiness of unbeing, close quote. Mankeo considered unbeing linked to synthome and the unary trace, U-N-A-R-Y. Two other Lacanian concepts regarding something beyond the ego. The synthome is related to the drive, quote, since the drive cannot be extinguished, the symptom continues after analysis in the form of the synthome, which allows yet contains jouissance as a fourth ring in the Borromean knot. The goal of the analysis is, in one sense, to identify with the synthome. Mankeo, 2012, seems to prefer the unary trace, however, which, quote, may be better described as a form of non-self or non-ego rather than ego or self that nonetheless undergirds and reknots the symbolic functioning of the subject, close quote. This non-self, quote, is a form of identification based on non-identification. And whatever is left of the ego after analysis, quote, can only be articulated in the form of the negative. This, quote, subjective destitution or benevolent depersonalization does not involve the dissolution of the symbolic, nor does it result in a particular personality structure. Rather, the awareness that remains after this process may retain positive aspects of different poles of personality. Mankeo noted obsessive and hysteric traits, but is beyond such formulations. The ego, then, is not a limit of psychoanalysis, despite its defensive and often destructive function. Through analysis, an emptying of the ego leads to a new subjective awareness beyond the ego and beyond imaginary identifications. The fullness and wholeness of the specular image open into the emptiness of the subject of unbeing. All right, next section, the fate of the ego. How does the orthodox conception of the person of hypostasis fit with the construction of the ego in analysis? The hypostasis in orthodoxy is predicated on relationship, as Yanaris and Zizoulis, among others, made clear. This articulation allows some framework to be established relating the psychic structure outlined by psychoanalysis and that understood in orthodox theology. In discussing the relational nature of the hypostasis, Yanaris even incorporated psychoanalytic principles in his formulation of the human person. Quote, the subject is born once, the signifier appears in the space of the other, close quote. There is some connection in Yanaris' work between the subject and the hypostasis and between the ego and the self. Lacan viewed the subject of the unconscious as the seat of desire, which is the ultimate measure of the ethical act. Quote, have you acted in conformity with the desire that is in you? Close quote. Yanaris established the desire of the hypostasis as, quote, erotic desire for life as relation, close quote, which he noted is, quote, easily confused with the unconscious disguises assumed by the sex drive, close quote. Reformulating Yanaris' comments based on the insights derived from the rereading of the fall narrative, it could be said that rather than the desire for life as relation being confused with or misrecognized in the unconscious drive, it is the unconscious drive that makes present the desire for life as relation in the fallen world. Yanaris seems elsewhere to have acknowledged this when he noted that, quote, for human beings, the object of the sex drive is that individual who attracts them precisely as a possibility of functioning in terms of life as relation, close quote. Taking the drive as the residue of the absent thing, capital T, allows the connection between hypostasis and subject to become apparent. The subject and the hypostasis are both subject to the unconscious desire for the thing, capital T. Yanaris distinguished hypostatic modes of existing. However, for him, each hypostasis chooses to be in life as relation, or to be in, quote, ontic atomicity. This echoes Zizoulas, 1985, distinction between authentic personhood and biological hypostasis. The former engaged in unbounded relational deification, while the latter is, quote, the fortress of individualism, close quote. How might the distinction between personhood in its fullest sense and individuality be understood in psychoanalytic terms? Clearly, there is involved some principle of identity in this choice, but perhaps not precisely one of identification. Moncayo's discussions of narcissism and the unary trace provided a strong foundation from which to garner understanding regarding the modes of existence that Yanaris and Zizoulas construct. Yanaris saw in the hypostasis of individual existence an insistence on power, self-fulfillment, and self-completeness. This mode of being is intimately linked with the imaginary identification with the ego, and perhaps even more primordially linked in some way to the imaginary God whose being Adam and Eve attempted to seize. This mode of being corresponds most closely to secondary and tertiary narcissism in Moncayo's formulation in the Elysion, the lack in the subject. It is only in end-state narcissism that the lack in the subject is fully assumed. Just as in the Orthodox Church, the Christian must assume his or her own lack through the apophatic and ascetic struggle against conceptual idolatry and legalism, the struggle against the imaginary and symbolic as forms of blotting out the real. Indeed, Moncayo referred to, quote, empty subject of the real as the subject in end-state narcissism, close quote. Although analysis and orthodox asceticism do not necessarily share the same end, it is not without reason that Moncayo noted that, quote, ultimately, the practice of analysis is a spiritual satisfaction, close quote. He even went further when speaking of the cost of being an analysis that, quote, mystical experience and Lacanian psychoanalysis share a practice of what Lacan calls subjective or mental psychical destitution and benevolent depersonalization, close quote. Though Moncayo connected this most closely with Buddhism, it is similarly true of the kenotic asceticism of orthodoxy. And the last section is entitled Revelation. The Orthodox Church announces this is probably my favorite part. The Orthodox Church announces it is the, quote, fullness of truth, but not that it is the arbiter of truth. In other words, it cannot be said that orthodoxy is true and all other religious or spiritual systems are false. Rather, all religious and spiritual systems contain some form of truth, and orthodoxy contains the fullness of the same truth. The fullness of the truth in the Orthodox Church is not bound up with the complete revelation or an infallible text, but is rather summed up non-comprehensively in the incarnation of the Word. It is the revelation of an absent and unknowable God whose absence one finds in the thing, capital T, which in some way transcends the darkness of the thing. The revelation of the Word is the way, quote, immortal life, quote, can run around, close quote, that is, the absence of God is sensible not only in the gravitation of the thing, but in the appearance at the level of Christ, or what is missing, as he took imaginary and symbolic constraints upon himself only insofar as necessary to point to something else, as an image of that something else, as the only mediator of it, as the high priest of it, as the one who points beyond himself by emptying himself. This revelation is important in orthodoxy, as it is that which structures the Church's practice and its understanding of deification. what leads to salvation is the love of God experienced in theoria, this is qualitatively different from a sort of thalassal oceanic feeling in that it obtains a personal relation, one that is never complete in the genital sense. The fate of the identification-based ego of the non-relational mode of being is clearly described by Galomiros, quote, "These men will suffer by receiving on their open hearts this penetrating light of truth," close quote, which is the love of God. Those who have abided only in their defensive imaginary and symbolic identifications will by necessity experience the love of God for the relational hypostasis as painful, as a death drive pushing for the death of the ego. God himself announced that, quote, "Man shall not see me and live." Inaris described the experience of hell as the realization of one's self-imposed, quote-unquote, incarceration in individualism while confronted with the existential reality of the call of love. This excessive desire for the hypostatic relationship causes in the ego a certain pain, a jouissance that appears at the level of enjoyment for those who have been prepared through ego death in life. Inaris described the process of preparation through orthodox asceticism as, quote, "surrender of the self and self-emptying through a love which is not of the order of social altruism, but an existential change, a process whereby individuality is emptied of self-determination in its conduct and relinquishes its autonomous resistances," close quote. The emptying of the ego, indeed its murder, is the center of the gospel. This is why conformity with the law is entirely insufficient for true life. Quote, "It is possible for someone to keep the whole of the law without managing to free himself from his biological and psychological ego, from corruption and death," close quote. The drive for death of the ego in pursuit of indestructible life is summarized aphoristically by Christ, quote, "Whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." The fate of the subject of the hypostasis of relation is one of openness to the supplementary jouissance that is the real experience of God's love, though this in the same fate to which the ego-based hypostasis is subjected. However, if the person is, quote, "concrete, unique, and unrepeatable," close quote, does the emptying of the self, the traversal or transfiguration into the empty subject of the real, mean the erasure of all uniqueness? Zizioulas concerned his work with the concreteness of the person as hypostasis, an instance of the substance, rather than simply an ecstasy of the substance. This is wherein the distinction from oceanic feeling is important for orthodoxy. The person must not be lost in the return to divinity in henosis rather than theosis, a spiritual devotion. For the Orthodox, the process of deification is, quote, "not uniform, for there is no measure common to all where persons are concerned," close quote. The thing, capital T, is not the same thing for every person. Thus, reordering one's relation to the thing, to the absence of God, and ultimately to God does not occur in the same way twice. The uniqueness of the person is a result of the mode of relatedness, the pursuit of God's presence and absence in one's own life. There is no nature outside of hypostasis, and no hypostasis that repeats another. Ultimately, Lacan himself offered an account of something like this process. The ich, in which is inscribed the lust-ich, or pleasure ego, also has pressing in its space unlust, the jouissance from the outside that takes its place as, quote, "non-ego negation," or foreign body. This non-ego of jouissance is related to Mankeo's observation that, quote, "emptiness is a form of jouissance," or a level of experience that Lacan said, "we know nothing of," close quote. This non-ego, or identification with something beyond the ego, appears in Kalinik's account of theosis, which empties the, quote, "narcissistic structure of the ego." This self-emptying is what is presented in a small way in sexual orgasm. The pursuit of the petite mort, As an icon in the fallen realm of the erotic union the subject seeks with the thing in which the ego fades. Moncao related the non-ego to the unary trace. For Moncao, the unary trace is, quote, a signifier without a signified, is an S1 without an S2, a pure signifier without a story. The unary signifier is a signifier of the void. And being outside of syllogistic logic, das Ding and unary trace appear in the same non-circumscribed area or open set. Just as the thing reflects the uniqueness of the hypostasis, quote, das Ding, or the unary trace as it refers to identity, represents the absolute difference of the things in themselves or their lack of inherent nature. The unary trace is a connection between the symbolic and the real, allowing something to be, quote, perceived from the perspective of infinity or of the unconscious, both as unknown in the sense of unknowable or identifiable, and the unknown in the sense of the totality of causes that remain invisible or that have now disappeared, close quote. It is the emptiness of the place of the absence of God that orthodoxy maintains, and yet also affirms an appearance of the thing in the word. The image of God, the likeness of which the Christian always strives to achieve through the emptiness of ascesis, is the unary trace of the Orthodox Church. Quote, the image of God in man, insofar as it is perfect, is necessarily unknowable. Quote, in other words, the image of God is the empty trace. The pursuit of God's likeness in ascesis is predicated on the self-emptying of Christ, which comports with the unknowable emptiness. One final question is worth considering at this late stage. If the pursuit of the likeness of God is the goal of Christianity, is there a point at which the Christian achieves completion, achieves some sort of genital and plenary fullness outside which nothing is? Manzarides, 1984, considered a similar question at the end of his work on the deification of man. Quote, this vision of God in deification then begins in the present and awaits its fulfillment and perfection in the kingdom of God. But even in the age to come, the saints' vision of God will not be static. That is because the saints, communing in the grace of God and rendered through this communion more and more able to contain the divine radiance, will receive grace upon grace from God himself, its infinite and unfailing source. Close quote. Theosis is a never-ending salvation. The subject always opened up further in its emptiness to the experience of the other jouissance that appears as the subject falls ever faster toward its center of gravity, das Ding. All right, thanks for listening.